white women were not just watching from the sidelines. They were active participants in slavery's worst cruelties. They owned slaves, made money from their labor, and used their power to hurt, humiliate, and sexually abuse black men. From using the courts to punish black men for inappropriate relationships to chaining men to their beds for forced sex, these women used race, gender roles, and property laws to maintain both their personal pleasure and the entire system of oppression. Learning about these hidden abuses helps us better understand how terrible slavery really was and challenges the common story that makes white women invisible as people who committed violence. The power of white women. Even though Southern women couldn't vote or hold political office, they had the right to buy, sell, and own enslaved people. Many inherited more slaves than land, making slavery the center of their wealth and social status. In Virginia, between 1786 and 1851, almost 9% of divorce cases mentioned interracial adultery, including 23 filed by husbands who accused their wives of having relationships with black men. This shows how white women could break social rules while being protected by their status. Historian Stephanie E. Jones Rogers found that about 40% of Southern slave owners were women, which goes against earlier stories that painted mistresses as innocent bystanders. The legal system created a strange situation where white women, while denied many civil rights, had complete control over enslaved people. Records from estates show that many wealthy widows controlled hundreds of enslaved people, running huge farms and city rental properties that depended completely on forced labor. White women actively participated in slave markets, often going to auctions to look at potential purchases for housework or field work. They built complex networks for trading enslaved people, writing letters to female relatives and friends across state lines to arrange sales and trades. These business deals were often written about in personal letters that show how casually they treated black men as less than human. White girls grew up learning to manage, discipline, and even brutalize enslaved people. Interviews done by government workers reveal that babies were sometimes given their own slave as a gift, and teenage girls were taught how to physically punish people, making cruelty seem normal as part of being a proper Southern lady. This upbringing created a racist identity where controlling black lives was central to a girl's sense of self and her chances for a good marriage. Young white girls learned to command enslaved children of similar ages, creating power structures that would last their whole lives. Diary entries from plantation daughters show their early participation in punishment rituals, describing whippings and other forms of discipline as normal household management. Educational materials for wealthy Southern girls included lessons on slave management alongside traditional skills like sewing and music. This complete training made sure that each generation of white women would continue and make the system's brutalities even worse. Sexual abuse. In her 1861 story, Harriet Jacobs tells about a male slave named Luke who was kept chained at his bedridden master's bedside to provide constant sexual service. A shocking example of how white women participated in the same sexual abuse usually blamed on male owners. Any act of fighting back could be met immediately with a beating, showing how women's sexual violence was backed up by the threat of physical punishment. The master's wife chose Luke specifically because he was young and physically attractive. The constant availability expected of Luke meant he lived always being vulnerable, unable to sleep deeply, or have any privacy. Former slaves who saw similar situations described the mental damage of such ongoing sexual abuse, noting how victims often became withdrawn and showed signs of severe trauma that lasted long after slavery ended. Statements collected in 1863 also provide multiple accounts of mistresses forcing male slaves into sexual acts. As abolitionist Captain Richard J. Hinton reported, "Every enslaved man who trusted him enough to talk told me of instances where he has been compelled, either by his mistress or by white women of the same class, to have connection with them." These testimonies show how rape worked as a tool of control, going beyond male-on-female violence to include women's predatory assertions of white supremacy. Many testimonies reveal that white women used their knowledge of enslaved men's family connections as leverage, threatening to separate fathers from children or husbands from wives if the sexual demands weren't met. The psychological warfare built into these threats often worked better than physical violence in making sure people complied. We have to also mention Thomas A. Foster's groundbreaking book, Rethinking Rufus: Sexual Violations of Enslaved Men, which documents how white women systematically sexually abused enslaved men through forced sex, false rape accusations, and forced reproduction. hiding behind myths of female purity. Using government interviews and slave narratives, this first book-length study reveals the intersection of sexual assault, attacks on masculinity, and exploitation. Physical violence. Perhaps the most famous example of extreme cruelty is that of Madame Marie Delphine Lalaurie in New Orleans. On April 10, 1834, a fire at her Royal Street mansion uncovered a torture room where male and female slaves were found chained, cut up, and covered with maggots, evidence of systematic sadism over years. Contemporary accounts describe spikes stuck into neck restraints, cut off limbs, and bodies packed into cages, an atrocity that shocked even other slave owners and made the public angry. Witnesses described a sophisticated system of torture that included surgical mutilation, psychological warfare, and deliberate starvation. Male slaves found in the attic had been subjected to particularly cruel experiments, including forced changes to their sexual characteristics and deliberate bone breaking that was then reset in unnatural positions. The discovery shocked people at the time, not because such violence was unknown, but because of how systematic it was and the evidence of planning required to build and maintain such facilities. Beyond singular horrors like Lalaurie's, plantation mistresses regularly whipped, beat, and mutilated enslaved men to enforce discipline. Many white women developed preferences for specific torture tools, customizing whips, brands, and restraints to maximize pain and humiliation. Some mistresses ordered custom devices designed to cause maximum suffering while avoiding immediately fatal injuries. These instruments were often displayed prominently in plantation homes, serving as constant reminders of the potential consequences of resistance or perceived disobedience. Forced breeding. White mistresses orchestrated sexual violence between enslaved people to produce new property and to get wet nurses for their own children. Advertisements in pre-Civil War newspapers sought enslaved women who had just given birth, creating a market where black mothers were separated from their babies and forced to nurse white ones. Such practices broke up families among the enslaved and turned black women's reproductive labor into a commodity. The breeding program supervised by white women involved detailed record-keeping and genetic planning that looked like modern animal breeding. They kept stud books documenting the parentage and characteristics of enslaved individuals, trying to produce children with specific physical traits or abilities. Male slaves were often forced to participate in these breeding programs regardless of their personal relationships or desires, with white women orchestrating sexual encounters and monitoring pregnancies to ensure maximum reproductive output. By manipulating reproduction, elite white women enacted a form of mental rape, treating black men and women as vessels to fulfill fantasies of control. These acts caused deep emotional trauma, undermining African American community structures and sense of personhood. They understood that destroying family structures would reduce the likelihood of organized resistance and increase dependence on white authority. This systematic assault on black humanity represented one of slavery's most devastating aspects, creating trauma that affected generations. Corrupted courts. Southern courts consistently protected white women's rights to abuse enslaved men, viewing such treatment as legitimate property management. Legal cases from the pre-Civil War period reveal how judges dismissed complaints of excessive cruelty when brought by enslaved individuals or their advocates. Court records document cases where white women successfully defended their treatment of enslaved men by claiming they were merely exercising property rights. These legal precedents established that virtually any form of punishment or control was acceptable as long as it didn't result in immediate death or total disability. The combined effect of these decisions was to create a legal framework that enabled and encouraged increasingly severe forms of abuse. Silence and resistance. Stories that exposed white women's abuse threatened the carefully maintained image of white femininity and were often censored or dismissed. Enslaved men risked brutal payback if they spoke out, forcing many to remain silent or use coded language when they did testify. The systematic suppression of these stories involved multiple actors, from publishers who refused to print certain accounts to scholars who dismissed testimonies as unreliable. White women themselves played active roles in silencing survivors, using threats of violence against family members to prevent disclosure. The few accounts that did emerge were often edited to remove the most explicit details, creating cleaned up versions that hid the full extent of the abuse. Despite widespread terror, enslaved individuals resisted. Some attempted suicide rather than endure sexual torture, as in the case of Lalaurie's 70-year-old cook who set the mansion on fire to escape further abuse. Others used legal petitions, like Louis Bourne's 1824 divorce suit, citing his wife's affair with a slave. Some fled plantations, seeking solidarity and self-determination in runaway communities or union lines. Resistance took many forms, from subtle acts of defiance to organized rebellion. Others created underground networks that provided emotional support and practical assistance to abuse survivors. These networks often included both enslaved and and free black individuals who understood the importance of preserving testimony and supporting those who had experienced the worst forms of abuse. So, as we have seen on this video, white Southern women were not passive figures in the history of slavery. They were powerful enforcers of its cruelty, from sexual exploitation to physical torture, from forced breeding to legal domination. They used every tool available to control and dehumanize black men. Their violence was not occasional or hidden, but systematic, taught from girlhood and protected by the courts. This video has been very difficult to make, but telling these stories is crucial so we don't forget the past, repeat its mistakes, or erase the voices of those who endured it.